Good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for a conversation between Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Charles Blow about his current book, The Devil You Know, A Black Manifesto. I'll put in my usual request here for those of you who have been here before to write your brief questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Some of you may well have read Charles Blow's column in the New York Times this morning, Awful but Lawful, which displays his characteristic meticulousness and timeliness. Twice a week on the opinion page of the New York Times and also as a television commentator, he always lets us know exactly where he stands. Provocative, searing, unflinching, and clear. These are some of the words that have been used to describe The Devil You Know, and they apply equally to his opinion pieces, which have contributed to this country's urgent dialogue on race and justice and are essential reading for many of us here today. And many of you will know that he is a frequent panelist at our annual Hutchins Forum on Martha's Vineyard, which we look forward to returning to when it is safe to do so.
Amen.
And we hope Charles will be with us. Charles Blow began his career as a graphic artist at the Detroit News and then joined the Times in 1994 as a graphics editor and subsequently served as graphics director and design director, winning numerous awards in those roles. From 2006 to 2008, he was art director of National Geographic magazine, returning to the Times in 2008 as an op-ed columnist. He graduated from Grambling State University in Louisiana, which is his home state. He lived in Brooklyn for many years before returning south to live in Atlanta, where he resides now and which he sees as a key city in a new movement for Black political power. And this is what we'll hear about today. Charles Blow is also the author of the 2014 memoir, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which was a New York Times notable book, a Lambda Literary Award winner, and longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award. And now, of course, of The Devil You Know, A Black Manifesto, an instant New York Times editor's choice and bestseller. It is this book which he'll discuss today with Professor Gates, who is the Alphonse Fletcher University professor at Harvard University and the director of the Hutchins Center as well. Please join me in welcoming Charles Blow to the Hutchins Center this afternoon. Thank you.
And Henry Louis Gates Jr. works for Abby Wolf. Let that be clear. Charles, it's great to have you back. It's great to see you. My brother, the South has been good to you. You look good. You look healthy.
It's lighting.
Yeah, no. I was worried about all them ribs. Collard greens you'd be like knocking down in the South. when I landed Hartsfield Airport, I just put on 5 pounds walking toward it. I wonder if I know people follow you and people read the reviews, but I'm sure not everyone has read your book. Would you mind briefly giving us the thesis of your book, the takeaway of your book, as a fair way to begin?
Sure. The book encourages Black people to essentially reverse the Great Migration, move back from northern and western cities into southern states where they remain large percentage of the population and where they could increase those percentages to a degree that they could, in some cases, become majorities of those states, thereby creating states and possibly a region where Black people exercise state control. And state control is crucial here because the federal government, the compromise of the Constitution was to award part of the power to populations and part of it based on geography. And the states got the geographic portion of that power. And many of the things that Black people care most about, whether it be criminal justice or mass incarceration, these are mostly controlled on a state and local level. At the end of the Civil War, 3 southern states were majority black, another 3 were within a couple of percentage points of being majority black. Florida was then 4 percentage points of being majority black. If they had simply not moved, that's a big if, because we know the reason they did move. Black people could right now control up to 14 senators, control more electoral college votes than California and New York State combined. If they voted over that same period as they vote now, you wouldn't have had a Republican president in the last 40 years. And last time I checked, there's not a single Supreme Court justice who was appointed over 40 years ago. So the entire composition of the Supreme Court would be different. That is what Black power could look like.
Excellent summary. One of the biggest surprises for me in making our Reconstruction series and writing the companion book, Stony the Road, was the fact that South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority Black states, and Florida, Alabama, and Georgia were almost majority Black states. That was astonishing, because then you realize, whoa, the rollback of Reconstruction was not an abstract thing at all. It was a reaction against the first manifestation of Black power, which was the right to vote given to Black men in the former Confederacy in 1867, 3 years before the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And 80% of those Black men, many of whom, obviously, the overwhelming majority of whom were illiterate, because it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, they voted. They registered to vote in the summer of 1867, and they effectively elected U.S. Grant President of the United States. And why do I say that? Grant won the Electoral College overwhelmingly, but he only won the popular vote by 300,000 votes. 500,000 Black men voted in that election, and we just presume they voted for U.S. Grant. And Thomas Dixon, is one of the biggest racists in the history of American literature, who wrote The Klansman, which became Birth of a Nation, wrote a book called The Leopard Spots in 1902. He said, giving Black men the right to vote was worse for the South than losing the Civil War. It was the unleashing of a heinous barbarism that reversed thousands of years of Anglo-Saxon civilization. This freaked out not only people in the former South, but also liberals in the North who did not think Black people were ready for all this power and had no idea that Black men, because women couldn't vote, of course, would take the franchise so seriously. And they rolled it back as quickly as they could. All right, Charles, 1910, 90% of all Black Americans live in the former Confederacy. Mm-hmm. And all that changed because of the Great Migration. But one of the reasons that they left was because of all those sheets and burning crosses. So how can you justify your argument that they should have stayed, that they should have stayed put? And by the way, as you and I have talked before, Frederick Douglass and Richard T. Green are the first Black man to graduate from Harvard College in the class of 1870, had the same debate in 1879 about the exodusters, the first migration, which was west out of the South, with Douglass saying, stay put. He was Charles Blow in advance. He said, stay put, our future's in the South. And Richard T. Green said, are you crazy? They're like killing and raping and lynching of people. So give me the counterfactual. Okay.
Well, the first thing I want to just add on to what you said, the ways in which Black voter enfranchisement were framed were always cataclysmic, mm-hmm. right? It was the great evil. People don't always remember that Lincoln is killed. His assassination is because he expressed support for Black people voting in the state of Louisiana. Louisiana had basically said they would be able to vote. And he says, why wouldn't they be able to? That sounds okay to me. And, and Booth said, well, that's the last time he's going to make a speech. And that was it.
That was it. John Wilkes Booth was listening to the speech on the ground to the White House.
Speech. And that, so this idea that of fear of what they call Negro domination has existed from the very moment that the Civil War was over. It existed before that, but not in terms of voting. They were afraid of these large numbers of people exacting revenge. But the idea that something they had never thought of, that the war would happen, you would lose it, and then these people would be allowed to vote.
Yes.
It was a staggering thing. Now, the other thing about that is, that you say, how could you say they should have stayed? I don't say necessarily that they should have stayed. I'm just saying that they should go back.
Okay.
And number two is you said that they left because of the burning sheets and the crosses. Not exactly, because they stayed there 60 years after the Civil War with the burning sheets and the lynchings and the crosses. So
that's a good point.
It wasn't until the economy collapsed with the infestation of the boll weevil that people just said, okay, enough. If I'm already dealing with all this craziness with the white terror, and now I can't even feed my family. And then they were open to the possibilities movement.
And they were recruiting.
Yes, yes. They were being literally actively being recruited. So so all of that happened all at once. I'm not saying that you should have stayed in the midst of terror. What I am saying is that today, some of the dynamics that made Black people move out of the South have been transposed and are now attractive for people to move back to the South. On the one hand. On the other hand, that the North and the West never truly lived up to the ideal that there would be true Black inclusion, integration, sharing of power, and a relaxing of oppressions. In fact, the opposite of that is true in many cases.
No, absolutely. And you make a devastating point when you say, hey, they didn't move until after 1910. You're absolutely right. In the face of lynchings of the apex of Jim Crow, they didn't move. They moved when the economy fell apart, and they could make a phenomenal amount of money in Mr. Ford's factory, far more than they ever could make picking cotton, for a month, in the sharecropping system, which was, as we know, famously, as a scholar put it, was part of the reinstitution of slavery by another name. I heard you on the Tightrope with Cornell West, my dear friend, and another dear friend, Tricia Rose. And it cracked me up when you found out that Andre Craddock Willis was Tricia's husband, and you hadn't known that before. And you said something that there were real differences between life in the South and life in the North. And I think you're referring to life in the South and North for Black people. Can you flesh that out? I was struck by that, and I took my little notes even. I watched all 113 minutes, and it was wonderful. And I went, okay, I'm gonna ask him about that.
I think I often think of it as two Black Americas, the sons and daughters of the children who stayed in the South and some daughters of those who migrated. And your relationship to land, family, and heritage are simply different. If you were a member of the absolute first wave of the Great Migration, or if your parents were members of the absolute first wave of the Great Migration, you have 1, 2, maybe 3 generations of Black people in this town where you grew up, whether that's Cleveland, Chicago, or Detroit. Many of those people who left, if they had land, sometimes abandoned it, some other times sold it. You moved into a space where land ownership was not central to the idea of community and empowerment, which was central to the Southern idea of equality, that you were going to get land, and that was going to help you to become independent farmers, and that was going to help you to become independent economic force in your environment. Migrants largely abandoned that concept and came and lived in apartments and tenements and whatever. So your connection to land itself, to place, is very different in the North than it is in the South, where the majority of Black people have lived for the entire 400 years that Black people have been on this part of the globe that came to be America. If I walk through a Southern cemetery, there is every cemetery, gravestones all the way back to the point where you can't read them. Because that, right? So because that's how deep the Black experience is in the South, and how connected you are to place. And many of the people in the northern and western cities go back to some family reunion in some place in the South every summer. And so that's different. I think there's because of that looser association to land also came a looser association to institutions like religious institutions and social institutions and all of the guardrails around a culture that kept that held up the rules. And so many the young people who arrived in the Great Migration were not bound as much by the mores of the South. Your grandparent wasn't there to see you go to the party and come in at 3 a.m. or whatever. And so, there was one study that I remember reviewing for the book where they said that participants in the Great Migration died sooner. And many of the reasons that their lifespans were shorter was kind of these social ills. They drank more, they smoked more, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of that happened. And I think because of that looser association to traditional institutions, longstanding institutions of the Black community, they created other institutions, but they also created an environment that was a bit more volatile. And so you got more, the reaction to oppression in the South was rooted in that Baptist religious concept. And so people followed the Martin example of how you protest and how you have civil disobedience, which was very different from the riots that broke out in the northern cities in the late 60s. And so you saw that combustibility. I think you still see a bit of that today, where the way people articulate their anger and rage is different in the South than it is in some of these other cities. So I think there's just a different metabolism to Blackness, depending on where you are in the country.
I agree. Let's talk about the role of class in the bifurcation of the Black community, the role of class in the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. One of one of my 100 amazing facts about African Americans is that in 1860, there were more free people of color, free Black people. We would have said free Negroes or free colored people back then, living in the states in which slavery was legal, that is the South and the border states, than in the free North. And here are the figures. There were 488,000 free people of color in 1860. There are 3.9 million enslaved African Americans. Of that 488,000, 262,000 lived in the slave states. 222,000 lived in the North. That's incredible, and it's counterintuitive because we were raised to think that as soon as you could, you were Frederick Douglass, you faked the pass and put on the sailors so you got the hell out of the South, or you waited for Harriet Tubman down by the big oak tree and you split, right? But it's not true. Many people did escape and follow the North Star, but scholars, that number was very small relative, maybe 25,000 to 50,000, depending on who you ask and how politically incorrect they want to be. And I point out to my students, the only reason Martin Luther King ever left the South was to get a PhD at BU. And as soon as he could, he faxed himself back to his home church. And somewhere Gunnar Myrdal writes that there will be a civil rights movement. And this is the 40s, obviously, an American dilemma, if I'm remembering correctly. But it would never break out in the South, it would break out in the North. And at that time, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is the face of the civil rights movement. But it didn't break out in the North, despite a long history, as Jean Theo Harris points out, of protests in the North. It broke out in Montgomery, Alabama, and with a young Boston-educated PhD who had the deepest roots in the Black community and the free Black community, I would guess. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that old Black middle class, the old free Black middle class who lived in the South. Did they stay in the South? Were they part of the Great Migration? Or they like, I ain't lost nothing in the North and I ain't gone to the North. Mm-hmm. And as you know, from our private conversations, I'm from West Virginia, which is like in the middle. And my family never left West Virginia. I mean, they never left. We could trace back to 3 sets of my 4th great grandparents who were free, 2 sets by the American Revolution. These are all Black people. The 3rd set free in 1823, and they lived 30 miles from where I was born. and they would never have moved, because part of manumission in the state of Virginia, which becomes West Virginia in 1863, was that you had to give the people who were enslaving the land to make it punitive. And they weren't going to leave that land for all the reasons that you said. So could you, it's a long-winded question, but you know where I'm coming from. Could you break it down?
One thing to remember about all voluntary migrations is they're primarily led by the young and the unencumbered, right? And that was no different for the beginning of the Great Migration. The Great Migration changes a lot over time, but in the very early years, in the first 3 or 4 years, it is largely young, unencumbered, single men. In fact, Congress commissions a study after 3 or 4 years to figure out where all these people going, what's going on here, and what they find is something like 90% of them are young, unmarried men. That changes over time. Clearly, there become more families. And I think towards the end of the Great Migration, there's more women than men. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's the way it breaks down. But in the very, very, very beginning, it's these young men. These are sometimes they are young strivers, educated men whose education will do little to help them in the South. But very often they are also, these are the men from around the southern cities. We didn't really move into the city and make these majority Black cities until later on. We lived out right around the outsides of the city, or on the Negro side of the city. But many of them, particularly in the years kind of after this first burst, are farmers. And so these are people who may not have owned the land that they were working and were looking for an opportunity to whatever. Wealthy people were not moving. If you owned a big estate inside or right on the outskirts of New Orleans, you were like, why would I go to Chicago and freeze
and be homeless?
That makes no sense to me, right? And there are a lot of people for whom that was true. I mean, I think the kind of hiding in plain sight story that you were kind of hinting at was that there were some people who, even during enslavement and certainly afterwards, did incredibly well, Black people in the South. And they just, all the complicated relationships that they had to work to make that happen, to be able to live a life of prosperity and not be attacked for it. Because we see so many times with like Tulsa where people are attacked for it, whole communities are attacked for prospering. But to have that prosperity in the middle of that is a tricky thing. One thing is that many of them just didn't look as dark as me, so there was that whole phenomenon of kind of passing and not passing at the same time, but the census still considered you to be a Black person.
The brown elite, as they called themselves.
Exactly.
South Carolina. Right?
Exactly. And what's the plaintiff in the famous case, Plessy didn't look anything like me, Plessy was the whitest white. Yes, right. Plessy is the whitest white man you could have gotten. So was Pinchback, who became the first governor of a state, state of Louisiana. But he looks like the whitest white man you've ever seen. But they were, so you could imagine how complicated this was. On paper, they are Black people, but the presentation was not what we are thinking of today as, oh, look at all these Negroes with the hair that stands up and defies gravity, and they're like prospering in the middle of these white people. That's not how it was. And in fact, during the Civil War, many of these wealthier Black people, freed Black men around New Orleans, got together. They were thinking of trying to form their own corps to fight for the Confederacy. They never
the first Native Guard. Everybody's embarrassed about that. People try to explain it away, say, well, they're under a lot of pressure. I go, no, man.
Their money was on the line.
Their money was on the line, but many of them did join the Union forces when it was liberated in 1862.
Yes.
But they showed
up. They never fought. We should say that they never actually got to the point where they fought for the Confederacy. But that was the whole point of the meeting.
It was. it was the first Native Guard, and they were pledged loyalty to Confederacy. You can't take that away. That actually happened.
Yes.
It's a shock. So you're right. Color as class and caste was enormously complicated in the South. And in a way, class trumped everything. And as you point out, class was a key motivator, both to relocating to the North, as well as not relocating to the North. How did you wake up one day and decide that, it's one thing to theorize, you get paid to theorize. I read you twice a week, you theorize about all kinds of stuff, but you don't move to Alaska. You write about salmon fishing in Alaska. What happened to you? Under COVID? You talk about the effects of COVID on the Black Lives Matter movement. I hope we come back to that, because I think your analysis is really brilliant and honest. But what happened? You just woke up one day, you had a nightmare, and said, I moved to Atlanta.
My COVID came with U-Haul boxes. No, I started writing, people have asked me why I started writing. I'm not exactly sure that I can pinpoint. I remember I was in bed when I was like, let me just start, see if I can write a book, this proposal, because my agent had been hounding me for years about it. And I just wrote for like a week, I think. I rarely ate, and I ended up, it was like 25,000, 30,000 words or something. It was crazy. But I think that what was in my mind was I had just become aware of this wonderful book about the movement of young hippies from the Northeast up to Vermont for the express purpose of taking it over and changing its politics.
Yeah, would you tell our friends listening to us about that? Because I was shocked when I heard you talk about this with Cornell and Trish, and it was amazing to me.
It is an amazing story. So there are the hippies are I don't think it's pejorative, actually. People call themselves hippies, right? We're protesting the Nixon's execution of the Vietnam War, and some of those protests grew violent. There were some huge ones, but Nixon kept going pretty much the way he was going, and we instituted a draft, and people were not happy. And there are two young Yale students, law school students, and they publish a paper in the Yale Law Review in which they argue that revolution is never going to come the way you think it's going to come. You can't have a violent revolution against the government, they'll put you down. But what you can do is this thing that we're going to call radical federalism. You can simply move and take over a state. And the smaller the state, the easier it is to do. And this paper this is a small paper, it languishes there, and then a more famous writer picks it up and writes a story, an article in Playboy. Yes, people used to read for the articles. And
the interviews. I love the interviews.
And he writes an article under the title, Take Over Vermont. And he lays out all the math and how easy it would be to do. And after that, tens of thousands of young white people move to Vermont. It is freer. They're able to kind of live their lives as they want. And they're able to, in the long run, change Vermont from one of the most conservative states in America to now one of the most liberal states in the union. It is the state in which Barack Obama wins his highest percentage of the of the white vote in 2008. It produces people like Bernie Sanders. They basically turned Vermont from New Hampshire into Vermont.
That's brilliant. It's a brilliant example. All right. I'm in my kitchen. You can see the setting sun. I'm going to stand up and before Abby sends me a text message saying the sun's in your face. Much better. All right, Charles, give us your best sales pitch other than the weather for leaving Boston and Cambridge. I'm right here in Harvard Square.
Okay.
And decamping from the state that gave us Gone with the Wind. I'm listening, Charles.
Okay. So what the reason for the Great Migration was a push and a pull. The push was this white terror that you've already outlined, and also I think the nail on the coffin was the collapse of the economy with the boll weevil. The pull was more economic opportunity and more political freedoms to live out your life. I believe that some of that is transposed at this point. Many, first, there's the economic pull, which is when Forbes does this list of where the Black middle class is doing best, that list is dominated by Southern cities. When you look at places where Black-owned businesses are most highly concentrated, the Southeast is clearly the winner in that analysis. When you look at places where real income has grown, the South does incredibly well. I even asked a professor at MIT who had looked at how real wage growth had performed for the last 30 years. I asked him to look at people in the South, both those with education and those without a college degree. He found that among those people without a college degree, the South had, for Black people, have been the most progressive in terms of actual wage growth. So there's real financial opportunity for people, particularly in the middle class, in the southern cities. Also, if you move to a place like Detroit, because of the auto industry, as you mentioned before, you can make a lot of money in Ford's plants. Well, almost all of the foreign automakers for the last 20 years have been relocating their factories to the American South. So where the auto industry in America is booming right now, at least for foreign automakers like Mercedes-Benz and Volvo, is in the American South. Right? And so then there becomes this idea of push. One is disillusionment, because the so-called liberal cities of the North never lived up to the idea of being racial egalitarian, right? So you could be truly liberal. You could believe in a woman's right to choose. You should believe in aggressively fighting climate change. You could believe that two gay people should be allowed to be married and still not be a anti-racist, not be against anti-Black discrimination, and not be a racial egalitarian. And this plays out very often in these big cities like New York, when stop and frisk was at its apex. Quinnipiac kept asking the citizens of New York whether or not they agreed with stop and frisk, knowing well that it was producing these negative effects of harassing these young Black and brown boys. Every time they asked, a majority of the white people in New York City said they were perfectly fine with it. That is emblematic of how these liberals can be liberal on every other subject, but also not racial egalitarian. And there's an economic component to this as well. There's this massive, massive suffering and poverty, even in a modern New York City. For instance, if you look at the Black poverty rate in New York City, it is higher it's slightly higher, but it's higher than the Black poverty rate in Mississippi. That is a national poverty rate. You might be able to figure out some way to get around being a single person with $17,000 in Mississippi. There is no way you can do that in Manhattan.
None.
Right. And that is not even to look at concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty is when a neighborhood has 40% or more of their people who live in it in poverty. That means it creates its own cascading negative effects. So it's not just you are poor; everybody you know is poor. The top 10 list of places with concentrated poverty, there's only one place in the South even on that list, and that place is in Tennessee. Every other place is in the northern or western so-called liberal city. And I believe that what the boll weevil did to the cotton industry, that the pandemic may have done to the rest of the economy, because it really crashed in these bigger urban areas, which are largely in the north and the west. Southern cities are generally much smaller. I live in Atlanta now. The population of within the city limits of Atlanta is only 443,000 people. That's tiny compared to New York City of 8 million people. So it really hit these big cities. So what I did was I went back and looked at Black unemployment at the height of the reaction to the pandemic, not at the height of the deaths, but with our biggest reactions in the second quarter of last year when we shut down pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect people and their ability to live? The Black unemployment rate in Chicago in the second quarter of last year was 3 times the Black unemployment rate in Atlanta.
My goodness. That's remarkable. But Charles, when I think of reverse migration, as it used to be called.
Still called.
Okay, I think of the upper middle class, people like you moving back to the South, Black lawyers, Black doctors, Black PhDs. I don't think about the homeless, the underemployed, the working class people. Am I wrong? Is this a stereotype that we have? You know, when people talk about my friend who cuts my hair and Larry Bobo's hair next door, Bernard Hicks, owns a New Image Barbershop. And the first time he went to Atlanta, he came back, he looked like he'd gotten the Holy Ghost, man. His eyes were shining. And he said, man, the Black middle class, they got lawns and 2 cars and BMWs. I'm thinking about moving, Doc. That's what I'm thinking about moving. You know, I was like, calm down, calm down. But it is astonishing when you first go to Atlanta.
Right.
And when, you know, every mayor since Maynard Jackson, right? You think, wow, this is amazing. And then there's Stacey turning Georgia like a miracle. You think it's the land of milk and honey. But am I right that the reverse migration is primarily of the upper economic classes within the Black community, rather than the people whom you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, would benefit most by moving back to the South?
Not necessarily. There are a lot of very young people. So we don't have these data consistently, but we do have them for 2014. In 2014 alone, 82,000 millennials, these are not people well established, left northern and western cities and moved back to the South. And what you have to remember about voluntary migrations, the entire history of them, they were never really among the most established. People didn't move because they already had a house and a job waiting for them. They moved on a hope and a dream. When people moved during the Dust Bowl, they moved out of desperation. When people moved for the gold rush, they moved with a dream. When people moved during the Great Migration, they moved hoping that what other side would be better, but they didn't have much. In fact, they called the trains that they went on the Chicken Bone Express. They had to pack food just to make it there, and so and even those young white kids in Vermont, they didn't move because they had opportunities or whatever waiting for them. They moved with a hope and a dream. Many of them slept in the fields. They developed communes just to survive, to be able to make it in Vermont. So do I believe that there is economic opportunity and people will, in the long run, have a better chance economically? Yes, I do. Do I also know that history teaches us that great migrations in this country and probably even around the world are kind of hinged on possibility, but not certainty?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that phrase. Are hinged on possibility, but not certainty. How does the recent African migration, if at all, fit into this? And for those of you who don't know, more Africans willingly migrated to the United States between 1990 and 2000 than came in the entire history of the slave trade directly from Africa, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And many of these people, I have a lot of friends from Nigeria, as you know, they came to New York, but they go, Skip, it's too cold. And they look at the temperature, they go to Houston, which is hot and humid like Lagos is. I was in a hotel, Charles. I was going to interview someone. I stepped into the elevator, man. I thought I'd been in a time machine. I was sent back to Lagos. Everybody in there was a Nigerian. And I realized when I got to the lobby that it was the annual meeting of the Nigerian Orthopedic Association.
Okay.
But does that factor in your thinking, your analysis of the
Absolutely.
African?
Because one thing that I was surprised about in the research for this book was the number one region that African immigrants choose when they migrate to America is the American South. I always assumed that it was the Northeast. It is not. Most of the region that attracts most of them is the South. And I think that part of, and for this plan to truly work, it has to have participation from not only descendants of the American slave tradition and those who migrated, but also many of the new African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants. What you're trying to do is not necessarily create Black power solely for the descendants of slavery. You just want a region of the country that is not governed by white supremacy or allowed to just live. And when that happens, I always tell people that I'm not promising you a utopia. If racial majorities produced utopia, then every white person in America would be thriving right now, because for the last 90 years, every state in the union has a majority white except Hawaii. But all of those people are not thriving. There is still crime, there are still murders, there is still income inequality, there are still food insecurities and what have you, because that is just part of the human condition. Furthermore, there are something like 7 states where the majority, the percentage of white people is over 90%. Surely all those white people are thriving. No, they are not. Still have human problems. It is just that in the aggregate, human beings will do better when they are not living under oppression than when they are. In the aggregate, we will thrive more as a collective community, not living under white supremacy rather than living under it.
Well, you certainly picked a heck of a year to move to Georgia, and we'll talk about that. But before we do, obviously we'll talk about Stacey and
Sure.
Reverend Warnock's election. But before we do, on a personal level, what are the biggest surprises that you've experienced, good and bad, since you moved?
Well, it's hard to be fair to that question because I moved in the middle of the pandemic, so everything's different. But I will say, just the normalcy of Black people being in control of things, and it's not a remarkable thing. It's just that's the way it is. Everything from government to you walk into a building and you go to your gym and everybody there, the Black person may own it, or everybody there who's working there is Black, and it's just normal. And
it sounds like going to Africa.
Yes, like totally. There are a lot of white people Atlanta is like DC, getting very close to losing its Black majority. So I think now it's like 51 point something percent Black, down from like 70% Black. So gentrification is happening in Atlanta just like it's happening in every other major city in America. But there are a lot of white people around. It's just that nobody's shocked if a Black person is in control of something or in charge of something. And so that's just a different way of living in a space. In addition to that, no matter who you are, what your pedigree and how much you make, being around law enforcement in New York City is still something that tightens your back, because you still feel hunted in New York. I don't care how old you are. That is just not the feeling you get from the police department in Atlanta. It's just, it's not built that way. In fact, I remember going to this is just an anecdote, but I was going somewhere and the building across the street was under construction. They had to do something where they had to block off the street, and police cars were doing it. And I walked across the street and I hear someone go, "Charles Love!" And I said, "Oh my God, it's coming from that police car." My back tenses up, and I go up to this guy. He says, "Hey, I just wanted to thank you for everything that you write and everything you do." And he shook my hand. Black guy. I was like, okay. And I'm like, I don't know. It's just, that's anecdotal. It just doesn't happen in New York. Like you just feel like they're trying to find a reason to do something.
No, your tendency was, I give up.
Yeah, I was like, what is it?
What was it like for you? I mean, typical brilliant journalist that you are, you pick the year of years to move, right? So your next book is Eyewitness Account, Daily Diary, from red to blue. What was it like to live in Georgia during the 2020 election and the two special elections that followed there on January 5th? And how did that confirm or complicate the argument that you're advancing in your very fascinating, readable book?
Right. Well, so it is absolute confirmation, and I was just like freaked out that it was happening. I had planned it. I didn't move here for that reason. But you know, two things happened simultaneously. One was amazing organizing. It's been organizing for years and years, but the recent organizing has been particularly strong, and that's where you get these superheroes like Stacey Abrams who kind of emerge as kind of the vanguard of that. But the other thing that had been happening was reverse migration. The Black population of Georgia doubles from 1990 to 2020, from 1.7 million people to over 3.4 million people. As you say with Grant, it is very likely that Black people delivered some of those states for Grant, but we don't have exit polls, so we can't say about Reconstruction.
Right.
You can say since Reconstruction, this was the first time that Black people were the majority of a coalition that delivers a presidential, a state to a president of any party. And not only that, it was the first time in the history of the American Senate that Black people were the majority of a coalition that elected a senator, and they didn't just elect one, they elected two. It was enormous.
Yes, it was.
Politically.
Yeah.
And part of what you're seeing in the Georgia State House is not just that it went blue, is that these Black people did it, and they came here out of nowhere. When people say they're changing the state of Georgia, that's what they're talking about.
Yes.
That Black population doubles in 30 years.
It's amazing.
Yes.
It is remarkable.
Yeah.
And the effect was phenomenal and palpable.
Yes.
And as soon as Ralph Warnock was declared victor, the legislature, Georgia beats it like that. We got to wipe this out. It just reminds me so much of the South's reaction.
They elected a Black man and a Jewish man. And
that's right. And Ralph Warnock said that. He said, within 24 hours, we elected Georgia's first African-American Jewish senator, and hours later, meaning first African-American senator and Jewish senator, and hours later, the Capitol was assaulted. We see in just a few precious hours, the tension very much alive in the soul of America. And the question before all of us at every moment is, what will we do to push us in the right direction? So what are we going to do about the voter suppression in Georgia? I mean, they went like, this is crazy and it's never going to happen again. Can we reverse this or not?
Well, it can be reversed, but you know, the fight is to overcome the hump, and they just keep adding a couple of extra buckets of soil on the hump, right? So the first hurdle is the governor's house. The state house and its composition is going to be harder to do. And in fact, you know, one could argue that it was the Holder Justice Department and Tom Perez, who was in charge of that at the time, who made it harder. You know, when this is before when they had their plan after the last census to redraw the districts, and the Republican plan would give them like 20 extra seats or something, and it had to be pre-cleared up until 2013. And somebody up there just let that get through, and that's the reason you didn't have Stacey Abrams as the president of the Georgia House. And so we're still living with the repercussions of that. But I think you have to get someone who can veto this, and that's a statewide. Governorship is a statewide race. I don't care if every Black person in Georgia lives in Atlanta. It's a statewide race. You can't. You know, you can suppress votes to get that, but you can't gerrymander those votes away.
Right.
And so they have to keep fighting until they come over the hump. I'm waiting for the new census data to be released. I believe what we're going to see is a staggering increase in the number of Black people who have moved not only to Georgia, but to other southern states. And I think I'm convinced that this is already happening, whether Charles Boyd wrote a book about it or not. Because there are four great migrations happening in America right now, all at the same time. And they're all kind of related. There is the immigrant migration of people moving from temperate zones up north. which is related to the climate migration, which is going to kind of rejigger where people choose to land. There is the urbanization migration of largely young millennial white people, college educated, reversing the decisions that their parents and grandparents made and moving back to cities. And then there is Black migration, young millennials moving out of northern western cities back to the south, which is related to the urbanization migration, which is another way to put that is gentrification, right? So all these things are slightly related, and you're going to see all of them going to be playing out when we get these census data, and I think it's going to be illuminating.
But if I understood you correctly, you said there were 4 kinds of migration going, and you gave us 3.
No.
The movement from cold to
immigrant migration, climate migration, urbanization, and reverse migration of young Black people.
Oh, the first one was immigrant migration?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear you say that.
Yeah.
Great. You know, I asked because I'm asking you to be a consultant for our new PBS series called The Great Migrations.
Oh, there you go.
And it is precisely, we're drawing on the work of Ira Berlin, who was like a prophet.
Yes.
And he pointed this out, dozens and dozens, decades ago.
Yes, of course.
And it's exciting.
I mentioned him in this book, actually.
Yeah, it's called, I call it Reconstruction's Revenge, and it's complicated. But you're right, the Africans, man, it takes them a nanosecond to figure out what part of America they want to live in.
Yes.
All right, we're going to open up to questions, but I have one more first. And Abby will come back and curate the questions.
Okay.
In your chapter called "The End of Hope and Waiting," in which you frame the discussion around hearing President Obama give a speech the night he received the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Ripple of Hope Award in 2018, and I'll read the paragraph.
Sure.
And I would like you to elaborate on it because I found it fascinating. As I pondered Obama's hope speech that night in New York, it occurred to me that he was only the latest ambassador of the political hope doxology and the inevitable blindness that it renders, that he has many other comrades in that crusade, perhaps the most famous of whom was Booker T. Washington. Eventually, both men were forced to confront the truth that all Black idealists must reckon with. White supremacy cannot be appeased. It can't be bargained with. It can't be convinced. It is America's embryonic fluid. America was born in it and genetically coded by, I love that genealogy part, the DNA part. No amount of hoping or waiting, coalition building, or kumbaya can redress that reality. Hope as a religious tool may well be essential, but hope as a political tool is folly. That paragraph left off the page. I went like, whoa, Charles took the mask off. You're getting down, brother. Gloss that for me, would you?
What do you want me to say about that?
No, I just want you to elaborate on that for people because this book is full of hope. It's saying it extends the promise of hope. It says there is a hopeful alternative that's just sitting in front of us.
I would argue with that. I would, the way I look at hope is the absence of power.
Oh, okay.
You only need the hope if you can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right? You only protest when you don't have the power to do it because you're asking power to bend and recognize your protest and to come to your side of the argument.
Gotcha.
Right? So in a way, it is the absence of power. Religiously, that makes a ton of sense. Like it prevents you from falling into despair. You have no power to change the circumstance. All you can do is believe that somewhere down the way, somehow it's going to change, and that is what hope is.
By and by.
But politically, it's problematic, and in fact, the fact that it keeps being pitched largely to Black people, that's keep hope alive. I went through like all of these slogans of either Black people or pitches to Black people, and the amount of time that hope became a central selling point for Black people was extraordinary. And largely that is because they are recognized that these Black people, you don't really have enough of you and enough power to change your circumstance, but be hopeful that something we're going to do it somehow. It's meant to be right.
Right, I got you.
No,
but you see,
right.
I was, okay, I used the wrong word. And as you define it, that's not what you're about. But you believe in the power of positive change, that Black people have agency, they can affect their future. Yes. That's what I meant by hope, that there is a positive alternative to the realities that are plaguing our community. And it's under our feet, or you can, use your feet and achieve it.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying hope is not synonymous with a plan. I have a plan. I don't have, theological hope in it.
Right.
I have, you can do this and it changes because you change power. And that is an absoluteness to a plan and a transition of power that is not the same as hoping and waiting and praying.
I accept that distinction and that correction, and I think it's very important. My point was that with this plan,
yes, we
can yield positive results for the larger Black community.
Absolutely.
And that's news, man. That's important. And you're right. It's different than much as I love Jesse and much as I love his capacity to rhyme. This is really keeping hope alive. It's generating the idea that we can affect our environment. We can affect our condition by doing something dramatic and counterintuitive, which is moving from the urban north to the south and reversing a pattern that began 110 years ago or so. Let me ask you a question that either Cornell or Trish asked, which is, which one is the devil that we know?
in my formulation of that, racism is the devil.
Okay. Well, and racism is present in the North, and racism is present in the South, but they manifest themselves differently.
Absolutely.
And we think that it's the force of one is less in the North than it was in the Klan-haunted, lynching-haunted remnants of the Confederacy. And you're saying that life is much more complicated than that. That the reality is
it's much more complicated when people they've done all sorts of analysis. I asked the people who do Project Implicit, which is Harvard is a participant in that, where they measure implicit bias. They've done this hundreds of thousands of times. I asked them to cut their data by region and by race. They found absolutely no different in the amount of implicit bias among white people who live in the North and the Midwest and those who live in the South.
Yes.
People have looked at searches for racist terminology. This is very blind. You never know. You don't even think that somebody is going to collect the data when you search for the N-word or whatever. And so that's a really good metric. They found that those searches were not clustered in the North, in the South, but kind of strung along the Appalachian Trail up into the kind of Southern New York. When you look at the most segregated cities and also most segregated school districts, they're not in the South. The most segregated school district is in New York City. One of the most segregated cities in America, or cities, I should say, in America are those in the Midwest, like Chicago and Minneapolis. So, people have this construct in their head that, like, the North is not. It's not like that, but yes, it is. And when you look at the growth of the modern kind of white supremacist groups, a lot of them neo-Nazi groups, those are not growing in the South, right? And the few Klan, we could still associate the Klan with the South. Number one, the Klan was everywhere, and
even at Harvard.
Yeah, exactly. I just and so Klan was everywhere, but the number of Klan organization is shrinking to almost nothing, but the number of these neo-Nazi groups is everywhere, and they're not in the South primarily. And if you look, even if you look at people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, look at where they're from. There was an analysis done of this. You think these are not all like Southern people. A lot of them came from California. A lot of them came from Midwestern cities. So we just have to constantly deconstruct this concept that racism is a Southern problem, when racism is in fact an American problem. And if you're gonna have it everywhere, wouldn't you rather live in a place where you could afford a home and maybe a yard if that's your thing, but also that you had enough political power to address the issues that came your way?
Beautifully put. You know, I love the fact, so many aspects of your work and the workings of your mind that I admire. But I love how comfortable you are with data. And you take these data and turn them into narratives. I used to, when you were being born at the times, yeah, I had no idea who you were, but I think once a week, right, you started and there'd be these graphs and bars and I'm saying, who is this guy? And I love those columns. You know, I was fascinated with all your little bar graphs and circles and stuff. And then they opened the curtain, it was a Negro. and you transferred that comfort with data into prose, and you do it brilliantly. I admire you so much, and I love this book. I loved it so much, I blurbed it.
Thank you. Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
and I want to lease your apartment in Brooklyn.
My daughter's in it.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. But I admire what you're doing, and I hope you're right, because nothing would please me more than the restoration of the potential Black political power that was stolen from us through terror and violence, and rape and lynching after the end of the Civil War. Nothing would please me more. Abby Wolf, Dr. Abby Wolf, come back on, please, and curate the questions for our guest, Charles M. Blow. And by the way, I'm sorry about the passing of your brother, and I found your account of that, your relationship, very, very moving, profoundly moving.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Dr. Wolf.
Thank you, Skip. Thank you, Professor Gates, excuse me. And thank you, Charles Blow. That was fantastic. And a lot of questions have come in. And I try to group them as much as I can, but I usually go out of order and, you know, get a little messed up. So I'll do my best here. One question comes in, an audience member who identifies themselves as of Asian heritage, asking, how do you see two peoples of color working together? There's a large population of Asians and Asian Americans who have already migrated to Atlanta. And of course, we saw a horrific event involving so many people in the Asian community recently in Atlanta itself. So I guess the question, I'm adding this little phrase, but is coalition building part of your thinking about reverse migration and how power will change in the South and in Atlanta particularly, or Georgia particularly?
Sure, and thank you for that question. This is, I think, where the conversation can get uncomfortable, but this is just the truth of it. Coalitions are great, but coalitions have not so far in American history given Black people reprieve from anti-Blackness itself. Because even in those coalitions, interests and political imperatives do not completely align. So when they work, great. Very often they don't, however. And so Black power cannot be contingent on other people joining. It actually has to, this anti-Blackness has to be erased at all costs. Well, two things that I will point out: it is hard to find societies around in modern times around the world where there are people look different, meaning there are darker skinned people and lighter skinned people, and the darker skinned people are not assigned the lower caste. Anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, not a US phenomenon. And so when we get new immigrants, many of them are coming from societies where it is also endemic, and it just isn't white that is oppressive. It is just lighter, whatever that society is that is oppressive. That whiteness becomes, has a definitional variation in different societies, whether they use the word I'm white or not. And so that becomes a hurdle that you have to overcome. In addition to that, in 2016, Nearly a third of all Hispanics and Asians in America voted for Donald Trump, even after he had exhibited all of his racism against Barack Obama in the birth issue, even after he had said that Mexicans were rapists and murderers, even after he had said that he wanted to ban all Muslims because Muslims hate us.
Repeat that statistic, please. So I want the audience to hear that.
Nearly a third of all Hispanics and a third of all Asians voted for Trump in 2016. And the New York Times analysis of this most recent election was that in immigrant groups, Hispanic and Asian, Trump's support surged. The idea that just by turning America brown, we will change or erase white supremacy, and also I include both extremes at the same time every time I say this, white supremacy and anti-Blackness, is not as clean as just the country turns brown. In addition to that, what we have seen is that whiteness has an ability to expand its definition and to include other groups to maintain its numerical majorities. Many of the people in this country now who we consider to be white were not originally part of the white people in the country, but whiteness expanded itself to include them, and that has helped to maintain supermajorities in this country. It is, whiteness, even among some immigrants, can be aspirational, particularly if they are so adjacent to that whiteness that in appearance, they can pass. And so it just becomes a very complicated conversation around whether or not browning can produce the very same effect that I'm talking about, which is to erase anti-Blackness.
Those are some hard truths to hear, but we have to, wow. Thank you. A question that's kind of related, I guess. What are your thoughts on how America has caused so many similar problems, similar oppressions for Native Americans? Maybe similar is not the right word. I'm using this word, but maybe we should tweak that a little. Can you imagine somehow expanding your ideas to help enhance or restore Native American culture as well?
Well, I mean, there's no way to, first of all, there's, like they say, there's no Olympics of oppression, but if there was one, the Native Americans would win the gold, because no population has been so decimated on this soil as has happened to Native Americans. And some of that was through disease, but a lot of it was through warfare. So, what happened to them and the shrinking of that population and the problems that still plague many reservation communities now is just like it's off the charts. Like I say, the point is for me and for this particular book is to create an environment where white supremacy does not prevail and that anti-Blackness is to our best ability eradicated. I believe that creates a better society for everyone. If other people want to be part of that type of a society, I think that's great.
Yeah. Thank you. Here are two related questions about class issue, which you and Skip have discussed already, but maybe you can add to it a little bit. Aisha Williams asks, how important is class diversity to this discussion? In other words, for purposes of constructing areas of Black power in the southern cities, is the hope that the upwardly mobile people of color would diversify less affluent communities in the South? Or is there acknowledgement that people will see communities similar to themselves, and does that matter? And relatedly, James Sullivan asks, lots of Black folks practice a form of white supremacy or ape the practices of white supremacy. If the cultural bonds and relationships among Black folks are not straightened out, moving together might create problems that are fairly predictable.
Right. I want to say two things that I think are very important that for me to always say. Number one, when I say Black power, it does not mean political power or Democratic Party power, or I'm sorry, not political. It doesn't mean political power. It doesn't mean political party power. It doesn't mean Democratic Party power. It doesn't mean Republican Party power. It means having enough power to put enough pressure on both of them that they actually respond to you. The second thing is that embedded in Black power is not the idea that they will all be liberal or conservative. In fact, that it is an acknowledgement that they're very complicated, that on social issues, most Black people are far to the right of me. I understand that. So I am not advocating reverse migration because it is going to produce societies that look or reflect my sense of politics or ideals, but rather that Black people deserve to have in this country a portion of it where self-determination of whatever identity develops from it can be realized. I hope and believe that with more prosperity, there will be more liberalism among Black people because it will not be so tied to desperation, hope, and oppression. But that's a gamble for me. I don't know if that's true. Even if it is not true, self-determination for Black people in this country is still important to me.
Yeah, I like to try to segue to the next question, but I'm going to give you a multiplicity of questions. Margaret Snowden asks what a person of color, this kind of goes to the Obama and now Kamala Harris situation, I think. When a person of color becomes president or vice president of the US, do they have a special responsibility to Black and brown people over the population as a whole? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are two thoughts. Number one is very little of the things that affect your daily life come from the executive branch. So, but symbolism is incredibly important. Knowing that it is possible is very important. That works. But it also speaks to the powerlessness of people, Black people, where they are. I say that to say this: people are most accountable to the people who put them in power. And if most of those people who could deliver the states, most of those coalitions are led by white people, that's who they're most accountable to. So you're going to see what we're seeing right now. Not as much force and legislation being put forth on immigrant policy yet. People like Kamala Harris to deal with that. Or what are we going to do on voting rights? Because we have a bill, they can deal with the filibuster and get around it if they want and deal with voting rights, but they're not putting that forward first. But we're putting forward the thing, the blue collar white guy proposal, which is infrastructure. And we can say that helps everyone and that helps all the trains move on time. And yes, but the symbolism of not the brown people at the border yet, not the Black people at the polls yet, but the white heads under the blue hat with the blue collars under the hard hats first. That is a choice, right? And so I just think we have to realize the importance of those symbols, realize and honor the work that those individual people did to make it to where they were, honor the fact that America, by the thinnest of margins in both cases, were willing to accept this person, but also understand the position that they're in. Very little, it's not a lot you can do with the big systems that affect the most Black people. And so when Obamacare, with all of its faults, it did help a lot of people. I always point out, said you have a HIV epidemic in the South before you had a COVID epidemic, and it was completely preventable. And most of the people who were getting affected were Black people. And most of the people, poor people who got help with HIV meds, which can completely control it and also stop transmission, can stop it, period. The CDC doesn't say it reduces the chance. It says you cannot transmit if it's under control. So the only reason it's transmitting, those Southern governors basically said, we won't take the money. Even though most poor people were getting that aid through Medicaid, we won't expand Medicaid. And when Louisiana finally, after Governor Jindal screwed up so badly that they got a Democratic governor, one of the first things he did was expand Medicaid. You know what happened to HIV numbers? Plummeted.
Wow.
Black people. These are people who were dying before COVID. Right? So that is one huge part of the Obama administration, that it's really a race bill. I mean, like it's everybody bill, and when you get sick, it don't matter what color you are. But a lot of the problems that Black people were facing were just basic access, and it provided that.
Charles, could you? I want to do a quick follow up. Could you explain how Joe Biden's infrastructure proposal is racialized? I mean, why wouldn't that?
I don't want to say it's completely racialized. I mean, and when you look at, first of all, there's, it's a big bill that's basically, you're basically reading summaries of this thing, because I haven't read, I don't know if they even have the inner workings of line by line yet, but if they do have it, I haven't read it. But what I've read is the top line summaries of things. And so there's things for everybody in there, right? So they give out a little bit. And I think in all of these Democratic proposals, because they give things to poor people, because poverty becomes synonymous with race in America, you end up getting things to Black people. The problem is that poverty should not be synonymous with Blackness. So but in the end, that blue collar world is not always the Black world. That's not where, we exist in that space. We exist. I worry about replacing hard hats with the idea of racial egalitarianism. And we seem to be full force, at least in the messaging, that we are hard hat centric, and Black people are yelling like, yeah, but we can't vote. It doesn't matter what kind of hat we wear, because our hat's gonna be in our hand. And they seem to be like saying, don't worry about it. If we just do this, then everybody's gonna benefit, trickle down some sort of way. And I just worry about that sort of messaging. And I'm very curious about how this first $7 billion is spent. I don't really trust the states all the time to spend that money, right? And make sure that Black people and every other group of people get their fair share of it, and that it goes towards things that actually build wealth, rather than as a band-aid to the lack of wealth. And I'm even more interested in this bill, which has a larger price tag. And I believe in all the future-oriented stuff too. I believe that we should be, having electric car stations all over the place. I don't see a lot of those in my neighborhood when I get my haircut. So, I just worry about it.
Skip, should I move on to another question?
Yes, please, Dr.
Okay.
Wolf.
I didn't know if you had a follow-up or not.
No, I was smiling with
okay.
Charles's my image of no Teslas in his neighborhood.
I have an electric car, but I'm just saying, like, I have they becomes a luxury item in transition. So so then it's like, okay, I get the future. We have to get rid of these internal combustion engines just for the planet to breathe. But, getting there, I just want to make sure that we cover all the steps of dealing with the poverty issue, and why, and untangling race from poverty. Like we have almost gotten to the point where we just accept that Black people are poor people.
Right.
And we design policies around that reality. Or
the converse, that white people are not poor people.
Yes.
But I'm from West Virginia, which is 97% white, and has and it's troubled by impoverishment. So I never grew up with that image of Black people being synonymous with poverty. I grew up with the image of white people being synonymous with poverty, that, the Appalachia image from the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, et cetera, et cetera. But you're also saying we have to do these things simultaneously.
Absolutely.
Because you said it can't be hard hats first and not deal with voter suppression and not deal with problems of immigration. Because Joe Biden is deporting or turning back a phenomenal amount of people. And many people don't realize how many Barack Obama deported. I mean, he was a huge deporter of.
In the immigrant community, they've never, you know,
yeah.
They call them the deporter in chief. So no, they remember.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, Obama has a capacity to, an image of him has been crafted as that is, does not account for the complexity of his presidency. Let me put it that way. But you're not letting people get away with that. So that's fascinating. Abby, continue.
Sure. So a number of people responded to what you said, your observations about policing in Atlanta versus New York City. And I think for some that elicited, there are questions about, is the South more racist than the North? Is the North more, that kind of thing. Sure. Someone asked specifically about the issue of safety and security. And they ask, would you please speak in greater detail about the issue of safety and security of Black people in the South today, and how to maintain the safety of Black people in the South in the event of a reverse migration that would bring more Black people to the South? How would, for example, a modern day Black Wall Street be averted?
All right. So the first thing, the monumental shift that has happened in the South is that the municipal South is largely Black. Mm-hmm. It's a huge difference, and it happened in the last 50 years. There are now 1,200 majority Black cities in America. 90% of them are in the American South. Mm. Maynard Jackson, I think in 1973, becomes the first Black mayor of a large Southern city when he became the mayor of Atlanta. And that was because Atlanta became a majority Black city in 1970, just 3 years before. But since then, my reverse migration plan doesn't include Florida or Texas, but since then, all of the places that I target for reverse migration, it is hard to find a major city or a capital city that is not majority Black, or that does not now have or has recently had a Black mayor. The municipal South is Black. And that allows for them to appoint police chiefs, them to hold the police departments accountable. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have police shootings. Atlanta had a police shooting right in the middle of the Black Lives Matter protest with Rayshard Brooks. But it does mean that the response is completely different. The officer who did that was gone immediately. The police chief chose to resign. There's not this idea of the Giulianis of the world, who's going to pull up your criminal record as a child and unleash, which is supposed to be sealed in a Dorisman case, by the way, and then publish them and say he's no choir boy, when Patrick Dorisman was indeed literally a choir boy. Mm-hmm. So it's just the way they respond is so different. The kind of metabolism of policing and governance is so different that is one shield that you have against disruption. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Charles, you reminded me when you said Florida and Texas were not part of the plan. It's important, and you used the number 400 years of our present. It's 500 years. It'll be our 500th anniversary in 5 years, because the first Black people to come to North America came to Florida in 1526. Wow. They'd been here almost 100 years before Black people came to Jamestown. That was the first Black people came to British North America. And it's a point that I've made with my friend Nicole Hannah-Jones, and they admit that, and they put that. 1619 has a nice ring to it, but it diminishes the complexity of the Black presence in the history of this country, and particularly it's the relationship of Blackness to Latin America, what would become Latin America, to the Hispanic experience, to the Native American people in Florida. So why is Florida, I understand why Texas is not, well, no, explain why Texas and Florida are not in the plan.
Oh, this is a Black Power plan. And I chose I chose states where Black people were already 25% or more of the population, so it's basically a head start, and where they were traditionally large portions of the population, right? And so, so Texas is just not. That's not. You're not going to.
That's not going to happen.
Be majority of Texas, and you're not going to be majority of Florida. It's just never going to happen.
No, but we almost won the gubernatorial race in Florida. Almost.
Okay, but you say we, and I don't know what that we is, because there's the we that is Black people, and then there's the we that is Democrats. So I keep trying to detangle Black power from political parties.
No, you're right.
So yes, it is true that Texas could flip, and also that Florida could move out of the purple battle state ground more firmly into blue. But that is not what my objective is.
Right.
The Democrats to solidify their states. My objective is to create enough Black power that it puts enough pressure on both of these parties to be more responsive to Black issues.
So the tipping point is what percent? What is the minimum level of the Black presence to be part of your plan?
I mean, I'm looking for 51, but I'm just saying you can have make a significant difference with far fewer people than a majority. Black people, even though they doubled their numbers in Georgia from 1990 to 2020, they're still only 33% of the population of Georgia, and yet with just 33%, they were able to make a huge difference in the direction of the country in this past election. When those young white people moved to Vermont, they didn't move in numbers that outnumbered the people who were natives there, but just their presence, their activist presence, liberalism changed the metabolism of the state. I think you can have an enormous effect even before you reach majority status on the metabolism of the state, just being young, activists, and whatever your ideology. So I don't have a magic number for each state. I'm just saying the more of those people who pour in, it just changes even before you get to majority status, which would just be 51, or anything over 50%.
Right. I ask about Florida because real estate in Florida has been selling like hotcakes under COVID, and I was hoping that it would be part of the master plan. But
well, the other thing is that I recognize the other four migrations that are simultaneously happening. One of them being climate migration. I cannot, in good conscience, ask people to move to places that I know will experience a climate crisis with rising sea levels and increased power of storms.
Right.
Particularly if those states do not have, or cities do not have, significant plan to deal with it. When I was thinking about moving, Miami was on my list, and I said it can't be. I interviewed the mayor of New Orleans for that book. Asking her, you have a problem here. Not only is the city of New Orleans slowly sinking, just like Venice, it is very vulnerable to sea level rise and very vulnerable to these strengthening storms. And they have a enormous, incredibly expensive plan to start trying to deal with this, but it's not financed. I think they have like half the financing that they think they're going to need, and they need it now. Mm-hmm. So, I'm very conscious of that when I'm asking people to move back. I even propose actual cities that I think will be prime locations for people to move to, and all of them are away from the shore.
Okay, would you share that list with our audience, please?
I don't remember all the cities, but they are all along what I call the I-20 to I-95 corridor. They are Shreveport, Jackson, I forget if it was Montgomery or Birmingham, and although Montgomery and Birmingham are good options for Alabama. They are Atlanta in Georgia. Forget where I have in South Carolina, North Carolina. Baltimore and Maryland. You make it in Wilmington in Delaware. But just trying to find places both that were away from coastal lands, because they're going to have the hardest problem dealing with climate change, and also paying attention to classic floodplains from rivers.
Yes.
Is this city experiencing an increase in flooding because of its proximity to a river or not? And if it is, it's just off the list. And
all those states were slave states, yes, including Delaware and Maryland, though people don't think of it that way.
First, nobody thinks of Delaware as a southern state, number one.
Right.
But the census always has. And And also that Delaware is the 8th blackest state in the country.
Mm.
And it's tiny. It could be for Black people what Vermont was to those hippies. It's so small that it doesn't take that many people to change it.
You're right. So my native West Virginia is going to stay safely white, as it were.
Yes, your native state is safe.
I'm sure. Well, I'm not going to say what I was going to say. Abby, how are we doing?
We're doing well. So are you okay with a couple more questions? There's one I must ask now.
Oh, go for it. If you must ask, I must answer it.
I must. This is from our current Nasir Jones Hip Hop Archive Fellow, Scott Heath.
Okay.
And it's a little bit long, but I think it's worth reading the whole thing. Okay. As a native North Carolinian who has lived purposely for several years at a time in DC, Atlanta, and most recently New Orleans, I am blessed to be a Black Southerner. And it is imperative that we, especially those approaching the idea from the outside, consider our movements in terms of pluralities. There are many Souths, especially beyond the popular cities. There are many Blacknesses, especially beyond the excellence advertised presently in popular media, often coupled with a claim to Southernness. Practically speaking, is there something presumptuous about saying, hey, let's move back South? Did anybody ask the opinion of the South? What are these Black returners bringing to us? Are they ready to make the adjustments required to contribute something useful to our Southern cultures? Or are they, God forbid, talking about escaping to and taking over Southern communities like those kids once planned to do in Vermont? Lately, I have grown very protective.
Charles,
great question. And
before you answer, I used to think, when I took my first Black history course my sophomore year, and I used to think the return to Africa was so amazing. It never occurred to me that Africa had real people there, had their own kingdoms, and that they might not be voting for African Americans to come back and run them. You know what I'm talking about? And the day I realized, I went, oh my God, I wonder what the Africans thought. And we know in Liberia and Sierra Leone, that was very problematic. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I want to say, number one, the Black people, many Black people, particularly Black academics in the North, resented Black people moving north during the Great Migration. I included in my book a letter from, I think it is the head of the sociology department at Howard, who writes a letter in the New York Times at the beginning of the Great Migration, openly fretting that these Black people from the South are going to come and mess up our equilibrium that we have with these white people. What are they doing? And we got to put some guardrails around these people and teach them how to act up here. So that idea—
That is true. The whole concept of the new Negro at various times had to do with a group of Black people saying, we are not like them. Mm-hmm. We are not like the great unwashed. We are not like these migrants. We are different. And it is a very complicated history and it involves intra-racial color consciousness, class consciousness. There was nothing romantic about the trope at all. But anyway, go ahead.
And so I had a conference call with a bunch of Black mayors earlier this week, and I can never get the Black mayor of Jackson, Mississippi's name right. It's an African name, and I just don't want to butcher it. Look it up. But his father was part of the Republic of New Africa, and their idea was the same as this one. And in fact, I include them in the book, which was to move south to kind of lay claim to these the southern states that were largely Black. And he moves to Mississippi. They don't take it well at all. But he ends up becoming the mayor of Jackson before his son, who is now the mayor of Jackson. And one thing that his son talked about was what the learning that they had to go through to actually learn to appreciate the Southern culture that already existed there and not try to come in and impose a more radical culture on them. So I'm very much aware of that. I'm very much aware that activism looks different even. I always tell people, it wasn't the radicals of the North and the West that accomplished the civil rights movement, although they may have contributed to it. It was those Black people who stayed behind in the Great Migration who did that. They fought the lion's share of that war. And so yes, I do not believe that the idea is to come and to tell Southern Blacks what to do or to take over their culture. I actually include the idea in the book that this cleaving of Black people into two different kinds of communities has been harmful in a way that the reunion would be helpful to. There is something really positive and amazing that has happened to Black culture in Northern and Western, what I call destination cities. But there's also something truly amazing that has always existed among these Southern people with a kind of a longer view of history and a slower sense of time and a way of thinking the thing through and feeling like, there's a more methodical approach to the issue and an approach that assumes that I'm not going to fight you and then we're all going to go away to our separate corner. I'm going to still have to deal with you. You're still going to be across that street or across that fence. So it becomes a different way of conducting a battle when you know that the person will remain your neighbor. And so I just think like the best of both these worlds could benefit from closer contact with each other.
And thank you so much. And one last question that moves a little bit away from politics and building power. I wonder whether your being physically back in the South has modified your thinking and writing on any topic in any way. So how have you changed as a writer at this point?
I don't think I've changed it to write. I mean, I used to, when I first started writing, I just didn't know how to do it. And I tried to sound like I should belong on the New York Times editorial page. So you're imitating whether or not you believe it or not. And I remember one of the other columnists or this came to me in some sort of way. I think it was one of the other columnists said, it should be like an orchestra. Every columnist plays a different instrument, but together it makes beautiful music. Like it is in your separateness, otherness that the magic is. And it was only in that moment that I could embrace who I was, my voice as a writer, which is that if I'm in the orchestra, I'm the banjo. Like I am a Southern boy and I'm going to sound like a Southern boy. I'm going to not artificially, but just like, how would I explain this stuff to the old Black people that I grew up with? That's literally how I think about almost every column that I write. And that is my voice. That is how I sound if I'm explaining something to them. And so coming back to the South reconnects me to that voice in a way that it was, that I would stretch to have to remember or put on old music to remember how, like James Baldwin say, he went to Switzerland and tried to finish that first book and took one Bessie Smith album because he had to try to remember what he must have sounded like as a child. And so I was, it was me in New York with the Bessie Smith album, trying to remember how it sounded. And when I arrived back in the South, I realized, oh, this is how I sound because it's being reflected back to me all the time.
Oh, that's beautiful. What a beautiful analogy between Baldwin and taking that Bessie Smith album to the village in Switzerland and you. And I think that your voice has always been your own in the pages of the Times. And if it's becoming even more resonantly yours, then the move, that alone is worth the move. But I love this book. I love the originality of your thesis. I love the fact that it's provocative and it makes us think. And I love the fact that it would be Reconstruction's revenge. So I hope that we live to see it. Charles, we know how busy you are. Thank you so much for gracing us with your.
So much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks everybody for tuning in as well. Thank you.
You were fabulous. Thank you.
We appreciate you. Thank you.